Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to Starship Troopers the Terran Federation Less serious video. If you haven't already watched the lore video, I highly suggest you go and watch that first, because in this video, we will be going through some of the more ephemeral ideas of Starship Troopers. We won't really be talking too much about the lore, we'll be talking more about the ideas, the point of views it presents, the problems it suggests might arise in the future, or have already arisen, and the supposed solutions to these problems. Let us begin, I think, with a little bit of a framing device, shall we say. We'll start first and foremost by talking a little bit about the author himself, Robert A. Heinlein, and then a little bit about the problems that he predicted would occur, and then thereafter we will have a look at his proposed solutions. So then, Robert A. Heinlein. He was one of the so-called Big Three, the best-selling science fiction authors of the 1940s and 50s. These days, Heinlein has been somewhat overshadowed by his two primary competitors, Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, which is a bleeding shame, honestly, because I would rank them like this. Isaac Asimov at the top, sorry Heinlein, but I, Robot, in my opinion, is one of the best works of science fiction ever bloody written. Then comes Robert Heinlein, and at a distant third comes Arthur C. Clarke. I don't know, don't get me wrong, he's written some decent books as well, but I never quite got the taste for him that I did for Heinlein or Asimov, honestly. Robert Heinlein also had a little bit of an controversial political history as well, shall we say. When Dwight D. Eisenhower announced that he would stop nuclear testing in the United States and any further betterment of the weapon, Heinlein went out strongly against that. And when the Soviet Union then carried out their nuclear test shortly thereafter, Heinlein viewed that as a do-or-die situation. If the US refused to continue to perfect and show a willingness to use nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union did, then that was it. The United States was over, and inevitably, the Soviet Union, with the willingness to use this weapon, would become the dominant power on Earth. Luckily, it didn't work out quite that way, and I'm sure Heinlein would agree. He was a vociferous anti-communist, to put it mildly. And Starship Troopers, written over the course of a couple of weeks after Dwight D. Eisenhower's announcement, in a fit of inspirational rage, almost, is equal parts science fiction entertainment story, meant to be kind of a quick and easy novel for young action-interested people, as well as, in Heinlein's own words, also being a clarification on his political and military ideas. Heinlein himself being very much so a military man after having served in the US Navy for 5 years, though reducing him to merely a militaristic individual or calling Starship Troopers a fascist novel, for example, is a ridiculous oversimplification, to the point where I would suggest that either the person suggesting this did the same thing as Paul Verhoeven and gave up reading the damn thing after a few pages, or the person must have a very fascinating view on reality in general. Though I can certainly imagine why particularly Starship Troopers might annoy a certain demographic, as Heinlein does take more than a few little potshots at his favourite enemy, communism, throughout the book. But the real target of Heinlein's ire in Starship Troopers is not communism. Instead, it is in fact our modern-day democracies. Heinlein predicts that sometime in the 21st century, the modern-day democracies will collapse beneath their own weight. Through rioting, mass unrest, insurrectionist activity, and the well-meaning, albeit fatally flawed intentions and actions of classes of social workers and child psychologists. Now, I will certainly admit that is, unnervingly topical in the waning days of 2020, at the tail end of some 3 months of rioting, looting, unrest, and civil disobedience, coming right before one of, if not the most important presidential elections in the last, 100 years or so. But, to be fair, it is all too easy to look back throughout history and pluck out a piece of writing here and there that sounds like it vaguely resembles a period of turmoil that is occurring right then and there. Though there are elements of Heinlein's writings that sound a little bit more prophetic than one might necessarily be comfortable with. The mention of child psychologists and social workers in particular, I think, bears further discussion. After all, how could possibly social workers and child psychologists lead to the complete and utter collapse of society, and then have further generations of veterans decide that the only way to solve the problems brought on by these two professions is to only allow those who have undergone long, hard, and rigorous service actually vote in elections and become politicians? I mean, that sounds like a rather extreme solution, doesn't it? Well, the question then becomes, if we really break it down, what is a social worker? Well, it is a profession where someone tries to seek out the unfortunates in society. Those who are down on their luck, may have lost their jobs, may have suffered injury, may have suffered abuse or some other problem that might prevent them from taking equal part in society along everyone else, and then marshal the resources of the state to help that person. Preferably, of course, to return to society and once more becoming a productive part of that society. A romantic notion of what a social worker is and should be, but the problem is, we have in our modern day civilizations made social workers into a profession. And the issue with that is, whenever you've made something into a government profession, you have now created a class of people whose own livelihood and welfare is entirely reliant upon there always being people down on their luck for them to help. See, that's a little bit of the issue right there. The ever-expanding definition of what it means to be down on one's luck. Allow me to give you a little bit of an anecdote here from Norway. I know a guy who works for a government agency over here whose sole job it is to find people who are homeless and on the street, and then ask them, "Hey, I see you're homeless, would you like some help?" And if they say yes, then he provides them with an apartment. He provides them with groceries and food and a little bit of spending money. Everything they need to exist in society. And yet, despite all of this, almost universally, within a few weeks or a couple of months maybe, the person is right back on the street again. Not for any economical reasons. The government has given them an apartment. The government is giving them money to stay in that apartment, and it is paying for their food. It is a mental problem with these people. My point is that whilst we are never going to eradicate pain, suffering, and poverty, even were we to invent a Star Trek level replicator, we have actually gotten remarkably close to solving the problem of poverty in many Western countries. And again, of course, I'm using the example of Norway here, but it is for a good reason as well, to demonstrate the fact that some nations can afford things that others cannot. We are a small country of 5 million people with huge natural resources, which are held in trust by the government and passed on to the citizens, rather than held by private companies, which may then decide to outsource a lot of its jobs should it prove more profitable. But we have now arrived at a point in Norway where the government is trying to give away homes to people, And yet it can't actually do it. Our standard of living is that high now that the government can't even give away houses anymore. Poverty in Norway. I've read genuine articles defining poverty in Norway as being unable to go on a vacation to some southern holiday retreat more often than every second year, perhaps. I have read articles suggesting that children are being harassed and bullied in school because they are poor, and by poor they mean unable to buy designer rucksacks and handbags for children. They are not poor because they can't eat, but because they're living outside in the park or with a box for a home. They're poor because they don't have the money to buy Gucci. And my point again here is, we have expanded our social welfare net to the point of insanity. And even in a country like the US, which again, with 300 plus million people, and with natural resources not held in a common trust by the government, obviously the US is not going to be able to afford the same standard as Norway. And yet, social security spending in the US, again, is rising and rising and rising. The deficit is rising and rising and rising. Because when you create a professional class of people whose duty it is to spend government money, and that is the very reason for their existence, you shouldn't be surprised if they find new and interesting ways to spend that money and thusly stay relevant. Which, by the way, is not a particularly difficult thing to do in modern day society. As Heinlein put it, once people realize that they can simply vote themselves ever greater and greater benefits, then, well, that is precisely what they are going to do. And then you add in the point about the child psychologists. I think on this one, Heinlein was a little off, but not as far off as he may have expected. He is talking about the infantilization of society, raising children to be weak, to be vulnerable and dependent upon the states, to the point whereas today we have people well into their 20s expecting to be treated like children, expecting to be supported by the government no matter what, and expecting even the government to intervene on their behalf to censor opinions that might hurt their fifis. Indeed, in many societies, we have even arrived at the point where hurting somebody's feelings, a so-called hate crime, is illegal and punishable by prison sentences. We have, in today's modern democratic society, people so insulated, so shielded from the harsh truths of reality, as to be completely divorced from the real world. And these people vote. They have as much political power as anyone else, and some might say more political power than many when you add in social media censorship to the mix. That is a very large problem. A very, very large problem indeed. Because whilst our modern nations can shoulder an amount of debt nearly unimaginable due to the huge quantities of wealth we all theoretically possess, the simple fact is that eventually, sooner or later, every debt will come due. This, then, it appears, is the fatal flaw of democracy, at least in Heinlein's view. If you have a huge populace of ill-informed, shielded, coddled, and frankly just ill-equipped voters that will continue to vote their way deeper and deeper and deeper into the hole, then, well, sooner or later there's going to be no crawling back out again. And it is hard to argue that point. It really is. We see it happening all over the world. Governments are heading deeper and deeper into debt, and the voting populace seem none the wiser, even less so if anything. I have genuinely seen people make the argument that the economy is nothing more than a fanciful fiction, and that if the government really wanted to give free healthcare to everyone, they could simply just print more money. Which worked out oh so very well for Weimar Germany, didn't it? Well, I guess if we don't object to another fancy mustache taking control over all of us, then hey, print away. I do not, however, agree that it is quite as fatal as Heinlein may have predicted. At the very least, not necessarily so. The thing that will have to eventually rescue democracy is not necessarily a smaller base of voters, but a better base of voters. In my personal opinion, the greatest failing of modern-day democracies comes in our school and teaching system. We are using a system that has been frankly outdated for 100 years or more. School children these days have far less need of advanced algebra than they do a basic understanding of taxation. Why they pay taxes, why they should want to pay taxes, how they can pay taxes, and how they fill out a tax form. Make them understand that if something goes out, if we spend $1,000 on healthcare, and we only bring in $100, then eventually the roof is going to cave in. To put it rather bluntly, we need to hammer into the head of every single citizen in our society that there is no such thing as free healthcare. You are going to have to pay for it, one way or another, and so you have a choice. Would you like to give the government the responsibility to provide for this, and in return support it with your taxes? Or would you like to pay lower taxes, and instead either take the risk of something happening to you, or paying a private insurance company, with all of the potential problems of private organizations obviously being out for profit? These are the kind of things we need to be teaching young people that are being raised in democracies. And yet, unfortunately, we are not. We are not teaching them about philosophy. We are not teaching them about morals, and we certainly aren't teaching them about the economy. And that is why our nations are heading for such turbulent waters. But now that we've talked about the problem, let us investigate the solutions a little bit. And let me start, in fact, with the question of morality. History and moral philosophy being one of the school classes taught in Robert A. Heinlein's book that, honestly, I would really like to see taught in modern schools as well. But I do disagree with the absolute nature of the teachings. The Terran Federation is of the opinion that it has discovered the one and only 100% objective, mathematically proven form of morality. I do not believe that any such thing exists. I believe that morals is a very difficult, very personal, and very subjective thing. Now, most of us can agree on many moral issues, certainly. We shouldn't kill one another. That seems obvious because, well, if we all start killing one another, that's going to lead to some problems. We should all be able to pay for what we spend, otherwise, again, society is going to collapse. We can agree that maintaining society, by and large, seems to be a moral good, but even then, of course, there are people that will object to that as well, on moral basis. For example, an ardent communist might tell you that no, society needs to collapse, regardless of all the suffering and pain that is going to cause, so that we can get on the road to creating paradise, utopia, true communism, which is simply not going to happen as long as capitalism is ticking away nicely. The ethno-nationalist might tell you much the same thing. Modern-day society is too stable. We need it to collapse first so that we can go, aha, see? I told you this would happen, and here's why. Now we need to segregate, and so on and so on. Now, these are moral positions. These are different views on morality. And again, we can absolutely argue which one is right and which one is wrong, but it is still a value judgment. It is something subjective. It is based upon what you, I, and everyone else value together. And the only solution to our moral conundrums is discussion, so that we may, again in the truest spirit of democracy, arrive at a common consensus on what ideas we wish to adopt and what ideas we wish to discard. Whilst also, of course, keeping in mind that morality is an ever-changing thing, an ever-evolving thing. What may have been viewed as completely horrifyingly immoral and unacceptable 1,000 years ago might be entirely fine now, and might be 100% ridiculous and disgusting again in another 1,000 years. Which is, once more, why I believe that no morality can be 100% accurate. In the case of the Terran Federation as well, I will refute their point directly. It states that moral behavior is survival behavior, and therefore moral behavior on the societal level is the survival of the society. And this is achieved through duty and sacrifice. Alright, that makes a great deal of sense, but if the survival of the society is the absolute most holy, then what you have in reality done is simply create yet another greater good. And it presumes that the Terran Federation is good because it has defined itself as good. Moral behavior is the survival of society, ergo society is good. But this is obviously a flawed line of logic. Society can turn bad. Even the most well-intentioned of societies that has voters is susceptible to simply a bad crop. Let's say that the Terran Federation is engaged in many years of grueling warfare. The people who come out of their service are the ones in the non-combat auxiliary corps. Let's say that they simply aren't as solid in civil service as the old crop of veterans. Let's say that they start instituting tyrannical rules. Let us say that the Terran Federation actually does start turning into an authoritarian fascist state, where a small group of voters have decided that, you know what, we're going to keep all of this political power, and because we are in the majority right now, we will simply vote to make it so. In that scenario, the continued survival of the society is no longer the best thing. Morality is ever-changing, and if a system turns bad, then yes, it is indeed moral to replace that system. Though to be fair, Heinlein does touch upon this in the book as well, in a more periphery sense, where he says that the only utilitarian reason for any society to continue to exist is because it works well. So, assuming that in my example the Terran Federation stops working well, then obviously it needs to be replaced by another system that works well, and therefore that is moral. I think that is probably closer to a universal morality, though again, I am not entirely convinced any such thing exists. Now, let us move on to the idea of service and citizenship, shall we? Because, frankly, this is the part that tickles my pickle the most, because more and more I am leaning towards a similar idea myself, though it is very important that we also recognize the dangers and the potential pitfalls of such a solution. Let us start, though, with the obvious benefits. As I said earlier, I think the solution is a better class of voters. People need to understand how our society works, why we use democracy as a way of ruling ourselves, the benefits, the disadvantages, the costs, and the profits involved. But simultaneously, I am also aware of the old saying, you may lead a horse to water, but you may not force it to drink. We could come up with the most perfect, beautiful, awesome teaching plan in the history of ever that explains every last minute detail of our government, and it would do absolutely no good at all if the little shits sitting there at the school bench just yawned and kept playing Peggle on their phones. The book touches on this as well in a history and moral philosophy class, where the teacher answers a question from a student asking, why doesn't the Federation go the limit? Why doesn't it make everyone serve a term of federal service and then let everyone vote? The teacher then responds, son, can you give me back my eyesight? And the pupil says, no, I can't. And the teacher answers once more by saying, you would find that a lot easier than instilling a sense of civic virtue into someone who doesn't have it. This is another point I 50% agree with and 50% disagree with. On the one hand, I absolutely agree. People are different. They have certain proclivities, certain interests, certain dislikes. It's not going to be for everyone to get involved in politics, vote intelligently and effectively in elections. There are people that are not going to be interested in the slightest about subjects of economy, of philosophy, of morality, etc. Absolutely. At the same time, though, rendering this to an idea of civic virtue, I think, is perhaps a little bit incorrect, because now, once again, we are playing into that greater good fallacy, saying that, well, obviously it's a virtue to do this. Now, yes, to a degree, I would, again, kind of say yes. I believe that voting is a virtue. It's something you should do. It is something you should view as a de facto duty because it is your political power. You, as a citizen, you're responsible for the democracy in which we all live, and it is up to you to make informed, intelligent decisions about the direction of the country. But at the same time, I'm not necessarily all that interested in forcing that upon someone, as that's also going to have a lot of complicated effects. In, I believe it was Australia, it is mandatory to vote, something that I'm kind of like for as well, but it also means that you get a lot of people who are just not bloody interested, and they'll vote stupidly because they don't care, and they do not understand either the implications of what they're doing. But you can't teach them. That's the thing. If somebody really, really doesn't care no matter what, you can explain to them all day long that if you waste this, your life can get worse. In fact, you're not even potentially jeopardizing just your livelihood. You might be jeopardizing the livelihood of everyone around you. You can explain that again and again and again, but if they don't want to listen, yeah, well, wringing blood from a stone and all that. It just ain't gonna happen, really. And this is where we finally, after a bit of a lengthy side waffle, arrive at the idea of service. Now, I genuinely do kind of like this, though right before you thought I was gonna finally get to it, but another short little, I promise, short sidestep. Robert A. Heinlein himself said in an interview, much later after the release of the book, that the meaning of the word veteran had been misinterpreted, because this has been one of the critics leveled against the book, that it's militaristic, only military veterans get to vote. Surely that is basically just a military dictatorship. I wouldn't agree with that classification, even if only military veterans got to vote, but, details. However, he then in an interview stated that that was not the case. His meaning of veteran referred to veterans of the police force, veterans of the firefighters, veterans of civil service, and he even stated that something like 19 out of 20 veterans came from these civil services. Now, I am of the opinion that it does not matter one itsy bitsy titsy witsy fact what the author says was his intentions. What matters is what he actually wrote in the book. And In Starship Troopers, that is absolutely not the case. It does mention non-combat auxiliary services, labor corps, human guinea pigs and truck driving, logistic operations like that. It does mention those, but it is very clear that those are a much smaller part of overall service. The main branch is the military, and one could even argue that the other ones sound militaristic as well. A labor corps, okay, so you're talking like an army corps of engineers, truck divers, logistics. Any and every army needs logistics, even in the future. You occasionally need to transport stuff from point A to point B, and it'd be a waste to use a starship. Even stuff like human experimentation could be the testing of new sets of power-armored suits, resistance against biological threats, etc., etc., etc. So it does sound as if service is primarily military in nature, but again, with some non-combat auxiliary roles too. And furthermore, of course, the placement officer doesn't need to give a flying fuck YouTube, as in frequently asked questions, about what you want to serve in, so you don't get a choice. If he wants people for the mobile infantry, well, there you go. You're in the army now, son. Now, this is an interesting thing as well, because I don't necessarily even mind that. Now, technically speaking, I would prefer a choice between two branches specifically. You either choose civil service, in which case you are given some rather terrible job, the kind of job nobody really wants but that needs to be done, and I'd probably say that that service is then going to be longer than military service, because the entire point of this is for it to be hard, it's for it to be harsh, it's for it to be uncomfortable, it's supposed to be a shitty experience so that you truly value your citizenship when you come out on the other end. And I think this has logical use as well. The old saying, you know, things held in common are held in contempt. Something easily obtained is not, you don't care about it. If you're just given something, it has no value. Again, the book brings up an example of this where Ratshak is like, I've just awarded you the first place for the foot race or something like that. Are you happy? And the student's like, no, I came in third. Screw you. And so Ratshak's precisely, because I just gave it to you, it holds no value. But because you achieved that third place, even though it's not first, that holds value. That is absolutely true, no doubt about it. If you have to work hard for something, you will value it far more highly. Additionally, if you're put through a shitty boot camp with a drill instructor yelling at you 24/7 and kicking you in the pants, then you're gonna be thinking real long and hard on whether or not that franchise is really worth all of this abuse. Are you actually gonna put yourself through this? And if the answer is yes, then you are probably likely to be the kind of informed, intelligent voter at the end of it that society requires, for no other reason than because you have put in the effort. That vote that you own, that is now valuable to you. It has personal worth, maybe even just simply memory value. You have imbued it with a point beyond its sheer political implications. Now let's discuss this a little bit as well, because, again, I do believe that it is probably a little bit of a overly severe solution, shall we say, particularly with the overly militaristic approach. There should definitely be a civil service option that you can choose, albeit you should probably work longer hours in a shittier position and probably for an extended period of time as well. As for labor corps and so on, it's also necessary to mention that mortality rate was perhaps a hint high in the Starship Troopers book. I don't know if we need to push it quite that far either. Granted, only about 14 out of 2,000 people died, so you could argue that, that's not too bad, but still. 14 people dead in military basic training. Ugh. I don't know about that. I think there's a few safety precautions that might need to be taken. Call me a old softy, I do suppose. But I do like the idea of service in return for voting privileges, because at the end of the day, the romantic dream of democracy, where every man and woman is an interested party that, casts his ballot after all due and careful consideration, is sadly an absolute bloody fiction. A lot of people just can't be bothered. In fact, half to over half of people just don't give a shit. Which, to me, is ludicrous. Like, this is the running of your country. This determines how much taxes you pay. This determines whether or not, if you're incapacitated, if you'll be taken care of, etc. Like, this is power. This is more power than most of humanity has ever had. But again, some people just don't actually care. There is also a certain degree of a demoralizing effect. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the argument, but my vote doesn't matter, and then I have to explain to them that no, it really does, and if you say it doesn't, that is the only point in time at which it doesn't actually matter. Even if your position doesn't get elected, the moment you have cast the ballot, you have exercised your personal power, and that is still more power than, again, 99% of humanity throughout history. And beyond those 50%, you also have a huge proportion of people who simply just vote tribally. I've talked to even more people who simply say, oh, yes, no, I vote for this party. And I'm like, okay, why? Well, I've always voted for this party. That's a terrible idea as well. At the end of it, you probably only have 30, 20, 10% of people who actually really look into things. And hell, you don't even need to be the most informed voter out there. I'm not insisting that you sit every day leafing through newspapers, as long as you at least have a couple of things that are important to you. Say that you're a person who works in the oil industry, right? You probably want to vote for somebody who's going to be furthering the oil industry's interests at that point then. Though, granted, I'm referring to the Norwegian oil industry, where it's state-owned rather than private. I do have that strange little thing where I believe that vast natural resources probably should be owned by the state in trust for the populace, but I diverge. Or maybe you're a public health employee. Okay, well, you're probably going to be voting for people who want to give you benefits as well. Just as long as you have something that affects you personally and you want to work towards that, that alone would at least be something. Again, in an ideal society, you would have a more extensive understanding of the costs and benefits involved, but, well, we're not there, are we? My personal conclusion is that no, it is actually probably a good idea to limit the franchise to some degree. How to do that, precisely what the price should be, etc., I'm not sure, because there are obviously problems with this as well. If you do get a small, entrenched group of elites who consider themselves the correct intellectuals, the authority on any and all questions, you run the risk of ending up with a tiny group of de facto aristocrats that vote to maintain their own power without taking into consideration the rest of society. In fact, I believe that might be one of the biggest dangers, because by federal service, you do in fact create an elite group of individuals who probably will end up valuing other veterans more highly than civilians, for the simple reason that you fought alongside these people. These are your brothers in arms, your comrades. They've shared in the same suffering that you have. Why shouldn't you vote to your benefit instead of the benefit of a bunch of no-name, no-face, slack-bellied coward civilians who haven't got the balls to put in the service that you did? Yeah, that I imagine could lead to a great deal of abuse of power, shall we say. Let's now wrap things up with a bit of a discussion about the Terran Federation itself. The idea of an overarching form of government that is placed above the nations and that is in de facto control over any of Earth's future, let's hope, colonies. In theory, I am all for this. In fact, I think it might even be an inevitability if humanity is ever to extend its reach into the stars, due to the simple fact that any such endeavor would be ruinously expensive and essentially impossible for any single nation. There are certain things that only an empire can do. There was a line of reason quoted in the book African Kaiser when describing the Uganda Railway. Only an empire would have the hubris and the material might required to do something so insane as to create a railway through some of the most hostile lands on Earth. So space travel is going to be that, except a whole lot worse. But, and this is a truly vast but, I would also, in theory, be in favor of something like the European Union, a unified trading and military bloc that unifies the various nations of Europe into one power structure to better our standing in the world. Absolutely. But in reality, of course, the European Union is nothing more than a tyrannical body that places its own rulings far above those of nations for no other reason than because they believe firmly that they are right, they are morally correct, and no one else's opinions, preference, or what is best for them matters. It kind of leads us full circle back again to the problem of having a small ruling body of elites. They tend to hold ever more powers for themselves. I suppose this is where the idea of civic virtue comes in. The idea of weeding out the chaff so that you are left with a good, solid core of men that would not abuse their powers because they are simply not that kind of person. Which, it's a romantic idea, to be sure. Whether or not it's grounded in reality, well, there are absolutely extraordinary men who will put the good of society above their own, but I would probably argue that these are few and far between. And when you get an entrenched bureaucracy like the European Union, or I fear something like the Terran Federation, things are going to get awfully complicated awfully quickly. And I do believe that any such super nation force, entity, government, etc., is going to have to kept in check by an extensive legal document of rights and independences. The government's power should be severely limited, which, to be fair, is something that is actually in place with the Terran Federation. The Terran Federation has absolutely no power whatsoever over civilians. It cannot interfere in their business, their private lives, their morality, their personal views, etc. Free speech is universal. You can say whatever you want. You can complain as loud and as strident as you want. And the only instance in which the Federation has any power over you is after you have volunteered, after having been thoroughly briefed of the meaning of volunteering and scared off from doing so as well by recruiting officers and told that you don't have to show up, we won't come after you, and anything like that. And even if you do sign up, you continue on to service and you decide, you know what, I don't feel like getting my ass kicked by a drill sergeant today, scribble some notes on a piece of paper and voila, you are free once more. That, to be fair, is probably a government that will be difficult to abuse so long as that freedom is maintained. But that's always the pitfall, isn't it? You may have a right, a legal power, legal protection, something that keeps you safe, that keeps your rights safe, but rights are only rights as long as either you yourself are capable of upholding them, or the government is capable and willing to uphold them in your stead. Simple fact is that if a government made up of the elites, the citizens, those with actual voting power, decide to take away a civilian's rights, then there is frankly very little that civilian is likely to be able to do about that, short of armed uprising. And, well, that is becoming an ever more difficult thing to suggest in modern warfare. It's one thing to rise up against a tyrannical regime when people were using muskets or swords and halberds. Even then, it was difficult. Now, with armies capable of launching precision-guided ordnance from the other side of the planet using drones? Yes. It is certainly a hint more challenging for any would-be revolutionaries of the modern day. And considering the Terran Federation has all power over the mobile infantry, the only real hope that a civilian within the Federation would have of an armed uprising would have to involve them beginning to manufacture their own power-armored suits, buying private-owned spaceships in all due likelihood. And there is actually a mention of that is possible. Civilians can own spaceships, and almost all of the information on how power-armored suits work, except for a handful of secret details, are publicly available to people, so it's theoretically not impossible. But at the end of the day, I am always going to be very, very skeptical of a government entity that de facto has no equals in terms of power, and the Terran Federation has no equal. Not within the Federation, anywho. So whilst, once more, theoretically, I'd be all for it, in reality, I think it'll be difficult to get right. And again, it will require a very, very strong Bill of Rights and independencies for the nations involved. There needs to be a great deal of self-rule until, eventually, over the course of decades, centuries, or millennia, perhaps, the nations begin to coalesce together, harmonize, and unify, which I do again believe is probably the inevitable course that humanity will have to tread at some point in the distant future. Right then, that is right around everything I would want to discuss about Starship Troopers, the Terran Federation less serious side. I'm sure this will spark some discussions down in the conversations down in the comments there, so feel free to let rip. I'm sure it might be very, very interesting. These are some high-flying topics, to be sure, and I'm certain that there are many interesting opinions surrounding it. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.